Thank you for that very positive and interesting introduction. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak after all of that. And so I need to confess right at the start, I'm not sure if I'm fit to give tonight's address. I've only actually had about 11 hours sleep in 48 hours, and I have been fed 3 glasses of your amazing wine. I feel a little bit like a guy called the Duke of Devonshire who was a British politician in 1902 and dreamt he was addressing the House of Lords in London and woke up to find he was. And that could easily be my experience here tonight. So please forgive me if I stumble over a few words tonight. Where am I from? I'm from a place called Kelowna, which is local Noongar, our local Aboriginal tribe, and it means home in the forest. A magnificent place out of Perth in Western Australia. And we have a very simple expression in the West. West is best and East is least. We are proudly parochial about coming from the West. And you know what? I've discovered that exists here. So I'm feeling very much at home. And if you look across the world, it's West Coasts that seem to be making the difference, whether it be Ireland, whether it be Norway, whether it be South Africa, whether it be America, whether it be Canada, whether it be Australia. It's the West Coast that seems to breed the entrepreneurs. And so I'm a proud West Coaster, and it's great to be amongst other people from the West. Tonight, I just want to start by just acknowledging the fact that I have discovered today that I have enjoyed the company of a whole pile of people who simply care. In my hometown, we have a centre set up called the Make Place, and it's a place where young people who've got an idea can come, whether it be a social enterprise or a commercial enterprise, and it helps them to and supports them to develop out their dreams and their aspirations. And proudly across the wall, we have this quote: "Unless someone like you cares a lot, awful a lot, nothing is going to get better, it's not." And I love that quote. And today I just want to acknowledge each of you for the way you care about your communities. The conversations I've had with so many of you have just come through that, you know what, you really care. And at the end of the day, there's no greater asset in any community than people who care and are willing to step up and actually make a difference. And so I salute each of you tonight for the contribution that you make back in your community. It's absolutely essential. Because tonight I want to talk about local leadership, because at the end of the day, it's the thing we've discovered is ultimately the thing that makes the greatest difference. I also want to acknowledge that most of us come out of small towns. My home place, where I was born and conceived, was a place called Marble Bar. It's up there in the Pilbara. It's the mining community, and it has the reputation to being the hottest town in Australia. In 1931, for 161 days consecutive, the temperature was over 100 degrees. That's 5 months. And so I love that particular quote. Marble Bar is best known as that stinking hot joint, which always seems to get a crack in the weather report. And that's where I come from. And I am a proud small town person. I love living in a small town. I think there is a quality of life that I'd never give up. But I'm also aware there's a lot of challenges living in a small town. And I love this quote: "The nice thing about living in a small town is when you don't know what you're doing, someone else certainly does, you know?" And I'm sure all of us who live in small towns can appreciate the sentiment of that particular comment. Now, I need to say right from the start, I have great apprehension any time I'm asked to address a rural conference, mainly because of an experience that happened to me now 15 years ago. 15 years ago in my home state of Western Australia, we had this amazing small towns conference. And I'll never forget, it was a conference where people came across the state, and it was all about sharing incredible stories of what people were doing to reinvent their communities. It was an amazing day of incredible stories. And at the end of it, we were all just so ecstatic about what we'd actually heard and what we'd learnt. And we had the privilege, though, at the end of the day of a local farmer from part of our southwest, and it's a place called Margaret River. I don't know whether that name means anything to you, but it's a bit like some of the areas here, the Napa area. It's a place where it produces only 2% of Australia's wine, but 26% of its premium wines. And we have a farmer turns up at the conference with 6 boxes of the best wine you could ever imagine. This was just incredible. And the great thing was that there was only 11 of us left at the end of the day. And so 11 of us had the privilege of knocking off 6 bottles of this wine. I can tell you, I love a good drop. And as we sat down and knocked off this red, it was amazing as we just celebrated what an incredible day we'd had. But then a young woman sidles up to the table and she introduces herself and said, listen, I'm only 16 years old and I'm here from the local newspaper. I've sat and listened to all of you guys all day and you know what? I'm a little bit disappointed. All I hear is positive stuff. She said, I'm a journalist. I've been trained that if it bleeds, it leads. And all I hear from you guys is just all this positive stuff. You know, this is the first time the editor has ever trusted me to go out and do a story on my own. And she said, you know what? I'm disappointed. All I've heard is positive stuff. Can you really tell me what you honestly think? And she was intent on getting a negative story. I thought, hang on, we just need to be careful. And what happened though for the next 3.5 hours is she sat with us. And what she simply did was kept filling our glasses. And you can imagine that several of us quickly moved into a state of total oblivion and drunkenness and so on. And this gave her a chance. And I can still remember her peppering me saying, Peter, stop being so positive. Tell me what you honestly think of these communities. And despite my physical state, I could still kind of like say nice things. And then she changed the tack and she kept saying to me, well, what do you think of this town? What do you think of Baling Up? Well, that's one of my hometowns. Baling Up is one of the most exciting reinvention stories you can ever imagine. A dairy town that's reinvented itself as one of the best arts towns in the southwest. And so all I could do was talk it up. What do you think of Boyne-up? What do you think of Margaret River? What do you think of Bridgetown? What do you think of Nannup? To all of those towns I could still say incredibly nice things. But then eventually she presses the right button and she says, what do you think of Donnybrook? Well, we people in Baling Up hate people in Donnybrook. We were forced into council amalgamation with Donnybrook. It's only 30 k's up the road. We loathe people from Donnybrook, mainly because of a grand final in football back in 1976 that we never won. And immediately she pressed that button and said, well, don't talk about Donnybrook. That would have to be the laziest, ugliest and most boring town we have in the state. But listen, and then she pushed me on. And I said, you know what? You drive into this town. It's the first town you drive into the scenic southwest. And what do you see? An industrial area. How dumb can you be? Here's the town where the Granny Smith apple comes from. And what have they done? The only thing they've commemorated is putting up these things that are meant to be lights resembling Granny Smith apples. And if you have a look at them, they're just full of dead flies. I said, Donnybrook is the home of Donnybrook Stone, where all of our public buildings in the city of Perth are built out of. But there's not one building in Donnybrook built out of Donnybrook Stone. Where was gold was discovered in Western Australia? It was in the town of Donnybrook. But where do they commemorate that? Nothing. You know what? This is a lazy, boring, ugly town. But whatever you do, don't write about that. Don't write about that. Well, 6 a.m. next morning, when the phone rings from the Mayor of Donnybrook, and his opening words, please excuse the language, you are an arsehole. He said, have you seen the front page of the Southwest Times? There are you, as an international consultant, describing our town not just as ugly and boring, but in fact the ugliest town in Australia. And he said, I am furious. He said, this is an incredible indictment on us. And he said, this is just unreal. You've wrecked us. You've kind of like given us this horrible reputation. You've wrecked the economy of this town. He threatened that he'd get the rugby team to come and tar and feather me, a whole pile of things he just carried on. What really upset him was that the local TV station had helicoptered into the town and had actually done a survey of locals on the main street. And 80% of them agreed with me. It was an ugly town, you know, and that really didn't help at all. And after berating me for a good 20 minutes, and all I could say is, look, I was drunk at the time and that didn't kind of like seem to make any difference, slams the phone down to my ear with the threat that they were going to take legal action against me. Well, I was reeling for most of the day. But then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I get another phone call. And this time it's from the President of the Chamber of Commerce. And her attitude is totally different. She said, you know, Peter, we can't believe it. We've never had so many visitors in town. You know, this has become the greatest tourist attraction that we've actually had. And she said, you know what? We think it's important that we promote ourselves as the ugly town. We see this as an asset, not as a kind of like a liability. And she said, you know what? We're really starting to have fun. You know, this guy runs the local service station in the town. He claims to be the ugliest man in town, living in the ugliest kind of like town and having the ugliest burgers. You know, they said, we're also trying to make money out of all of this stuff. So we produced a whole pile of T-shirts. You know, if you think I'm ugly, you should see Donnybrook. Well, I didn't mind that edition. Then when they put out an edition that said, if you think Donnybrook's ugly, you should see Peter Kenyon. I really thought that was getting a bit too personal. That was kind of like really kind of like getting out of the way and so on. But here was a town who suddenly grabbed hold of an opportunity and decided to do something with it. But then she then said, you know what though, Peter, we also consider you owe it to us. And we reckon if you turned up in the town, not in a month's time, but actually this week, we would stack the public meet at the town hall with a public meeting. Now, Donnybrook was really the last town I was thinking of visiting, I can tell you, for a long time. But she was persistent. She was an opportunist. She said, you owe it to us. She promised me a bodyguard and a whole pile of things. And so 3 nights later, on a typical Donnybrook night, it was cold, wet, miserable, raining, just like Donnybrook and whatever, I turn up in this particular town. And she hung me out to dry. I got up and I have never had so many apples thrown at me. I'd never had kind of like so many hoo-has, you know, but overwhelmingly, probably 60% of people in that room, there were 400 people in that town hall. The majority did support the comments I was making. There was, though, 40% of the population who were highly offended by what I'd actually said about their town. And boy, she used it to her advantage. And so for 40 minutes, we had this amazing hoo-ha of a meeting. Boy, it was entertaining to be there. But then she stopped the meeting and said, you know what? Whether or not you agree or disagree with what Peter said, we've got to agree that we do not put our best foot forward. We are the apple town. We are kind of like where gold was discovered. We are the start of the most scenic kind of like route in the southwest. We are the home of Donnybrook Stone. But none of those things are really captured. We have forgotten what our incredible assets are about. And that night she turned then the meeting into this amazing conversation about what is it we're going to do. And you know, that night hundreds of ideas were generated about what the town could do with its assets. For example, it was the apple town. And so people started talking about how do we restore that. They hadn't had an apple festival for over 8 years. But that night, people stepped up and said, you know what, let's form an action group to restore the apple festival in the town. And it's today one of the key festivals that's actually held in the southwest. You know, there was a whole pile of people who said, you know, Peter's comments about the fact that you accelerate the drive through the town is actually true. Look at how our main street, despite all of its heritage buildings, we've never done anything with it. You don't get a second chance at first impressions. And that night, a whole group of people came together and said, you know what? Let's form an action group to start reinventing our actual main street. And the Chamber of Commerce in the town said, you know what? We'll take that on as our particular project. And within less than a 12-month period, they raised over $2 million to invest in that main street and start to turn it into something incredible. That was the early stages. Today, when you drive in, it's far, far more beautiful than that, because all down the main street are all these flowering, kind of like apple trees and whatever. And this became a town where people wanted to be. Someone said that night, have you seen how much waste we have with all the apples that just fall on the ground? I've always thought that, you know what, we should start up an apple cider business. And that idea was fed that night, and today, probably over 20 people are employed in that particular local enterprise that actually kind of like came out of the place. And then I'll never forget, there was someone there from the Lions Club who said, you know what, we need something that will stop people as they drive through our town. And my club, the Lions Club, want to put up, why don't we create the biggest free playground in Australia? And what have they done? They have built the most amazing kind of like playground, the biggest free playground that we have in Australia. And boy, is it a stopper in the main street. Open 24 hours a day, floodlit, people stop, and then they wander into the shops in the main street. Personally, I think it's still pretty ugly, but you know, I'm not allowed to say that. But you know what? It is an amazing kind of like initiative that actually came out of that place. And I suppose it gave me a lot of relief 6 months down the track, and they literally had hundreds of newspaper reports on this town. Ugly duckling Donnybrook fights back. And today it is one of the most charming communities that you'd ever want to drive through. It's a community that kind of like grabbed an opportunity. Despite the kind of like the controversy and the negativity of it, they saw it. And it was mainly that person, that president of that Chamber of Commerce, who saw an opportunity, and boy, did she drive the advantage home. An amazing example of a town that really rebirthed itself through something like that. Now, let me say, I have had 3 glasses of wine tonight, and I am capable of claiming this town's pretty ugly, but I will resist the temptation. Can I say tonight, I want to really just reiterate 3 simple points. And the first is, one of the things I've learned about rural reinvention is simply this. Lesson number 1, the future ain't what it used to be. And we just got to recognise that we do not live in the type of rural communities that we knew in the 60s and 70s. When I look at the reality of the country I come from, all of our small towns are under incredible challenges. And I imagine many of those challenges on that slide is what many of your kind of like communities are actually reeling from as well. The second lesson that I've learned, and it's the one that I hope I reinforce this morning, is that whatever the issue, I still believe it's community, not the latest government program or scheme, but community that's actually the answer in terms of the reinvention that we actually need. I work on this simple rule. Rule number 1, citizens have the answers. Rule number 2, when in doubt, refer to rule number 1. I believe passionately that whatever the issue, it's community, it is citizens that live in those towns that we got to consider the greatest resource that we need to mobilise. To me, great communities don't happen. They're created, they're nurtured, they're sustained by caring, connected and involved residents. Not the latest scheme. People make kind of like communities. And as I look across communities in Australia, often 2 communities are mere 30 kilometres apart. One's going forward and one's going back. They share the same weather, they share the same location, they share the same productivity in their soil, but one's going forward and one's going back. What's the difference? It all comes back to people. And within that, can I say, what I have discovered is the importance of people like yourself, who provide what I call that local leadership. Those community builders who are prepared to step up and commit their time and often their own resources to actually start making things happen within their communities. 20 years ago, our national government decided to employ a group called McKinsey & Co. It's an international consultancy company. And they asked them to look at why is it that in Australia certain regions are going ahead and certain towns are going ahead, but other regions are going backwards. What makes the difference? And they paid them $1 million to carry out this particular consultancy. At the end of spending $1 million, they came up with a report that was summarised in one sentence. I reckon that one sentence was literally worth $1 million. It's an amazing quote. And it's simply that, given the task of rejuvenating a region or a town and the choice of $50 million or only $2 million and 20 committed local leaders, we would choose the smaller amount of money and the committed leaders. And my experience of working with rural communities over the last 4 decades is that is absolutely spot on. It is all about local leadership. Local people and a group of local community builders actually is what makes the difference between a community going forward and a community going backwards. What do we mean by leadership? Well, I think our famous General George Patton captured it very well. Leadership is the thing that wins battles. I have it, but I'm damned if I can define it. And I think trying to define the qualities of leadership is frustrating, and let me say, I think a useless task. But what I think is helpful is to kind of like understand what is the functions of leadership. Not so much the qualities of leadership, but what is the functions of leadership. And certainly from our work in rural communities, we believe that there are 6 critical functions that local leaders need to perform. The first of it is simply local leadership needs to make things happen. I love that quote. Leadership is not necessarily a title or a powerful position. It's a process. It's relational. It is making something happen. It's leaving a mark. I spent a number of years learning from the experience of Nebraska in the United States. And I'll never forget they did a study that basically went into a number of towns and asked people, who do you think are your leaders? And what they found was that 70% of the names they were given were male. 70% of the names they were given were in the 50 to 70 age group. And 70% of the names they were given that title leadership or leader because of their position. They were the mayor, they were a councillor, they were a local politician, they were the head of the bank, they were the principal of the local high school. They accrued and allocated leadership to a title. But what I find interesting about the study, they then asked people a second question. Who makes things happen in your town? And guess what? 70% of the names they were given were women. 70% of the names that were given were in the 50 to 70 age group. And 70% of the names that were given didn't do it from position, but from passion. And that's the group I think are our true leaders. The ones who step up and actually make things happen in their community. John Gardner was an advisor to 5 US presidents. He'd have to be famous because he appeared on the front page of a Time magazine. So he was a pretty significant US person. And what I love was his quote, "A leader's task is to open doors and windows." And I think that is probably the best definition of the role of leadership that I actually know. I also love Tom Peters' thing, sooner or later, all the thinking and planning has to degenerate into work. You know, many of our small towns are littered with strategic documents all sitting on the shelf. You know, at the end of the day, it's people who step up and start making things happen. That is what leadership is actually all about. Let me share with you one of my favourite communities. This is the second nicest community I know anywhere in the world after the one you come from. It is called Coolin. It sits out on the rabbit-proof fence in Western Australia. That's a good 3.5 hours out of Perth. Sits out there on the rabbit-proof fence, meaning that it's really moving into unproductive type, kind of like land and whatever. It's a sheep wheat type of town. And I always remember being part of a conversation they had 22 years ago when the town was down to 287 people. And they came together and said, listen, we have to do something to stop the depopulation. And that night, 75 people gathered in a room and we had a conversation, and they basically came to the conclusion that they wanted to do two things to stop that population. Firstly, they needed to become more than a dot on the map. And secondly, they needed to build local pride and people's local resident commitment to their town. And with that as their mission, they have, over the last 20 years, instigated the most amazing reinvention initiative. From a point of 287 people, they now have 450 people living in that town. 450 mightn't seem a lot, but you know what? That's about a 40% growth. And every other town around them has lost 40% population. They have grown by 40%. And it's been through their own efforts. The first thing they realised is they needed a significant annual event. And one local farmer had this amazing property running along the lake and kind of like gave that to the town. And they created this amazing thing called the Coolin Bush Races. It's held on the long weekend in October, and it attracts somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people come into the town. The reason they felt they needed this was to have a boost to the local businesses. You imagine 10,000 people coming in to your community for 3 days, what it does to the local economy, what it does to kind of like local feeling. And boy, this event, which has now been run for over 20 years, has won so many awards as a regional event. And that was the first thing they decided to do. Let's become more than that dot on the map. They had the stupidity to ask their young people, what is it that would make a difference to you in town? And the young people were pretty clear. We want a water park. Well, when you ask people, you're going to follow up on that. And guess what? 3 farmers drove 3,000 kilometres over the Nullarbor Desert to Queensland and bought a second-hand water slide for $100,000 from the Gold Coast, and then drove 3,000 kilometres back and assembled it. That's commitment. And you know what? Today, Coolin is the regional hangout space on weekends. Where do you think in our hot summers all the families of the wheat belt hang out on weekends? It's called Coolin, because Coolin has this spectacular water slide and it's become a regional destination for families on weekends. They recognised if you wanted to attract people in the town, you can't but have an impressive kind of like town heart. And they put effort. They come into how they could capture all of the surplus water and then pump it back. And you drive into their town today and boy, has it got a stunning town heart. You drive in and think, wow, this is a pretty special town. And then they had lost their only bank when the big banks in Australia, kind of like 15 years ago, decided to close down all of their small town banks. Not because they were losing money, this was all about making more money. If you could kind of like close down banks, sell off the real estate, sack staff, you can return more to the shareholder. And the local people said, you know what, the bank is probably the most profitable business in town. And they came together, raised the money and created their own community bank. Today, not only does that bank employ 6 staff, return back old-fashioned banking services like opening on a Saturday morning, but it returns back close to $200,000 every year as a profit to the town, which is then put into activities. This is a town that decided to take action through its leadership. And then they said, you know what, there's this famous tourist attraction called Wave Rock. People tend to drive just up the highway, but you know what, we could create an alternative route. We'll need to seal at least 40 kilometres of road because people don't like travelling on gravel. But why don't we create an alternative route? And one of the things they decided to do was to create what they called the Tin Horse Highway. Because local farmers, as part of the Coolin Bush Races, started doing these crazy tin things on their farms as you drove along. And they had about 40 of them. And they thought, you know what? If we have workshops, we could have 200 of them. And so they have just developed these amazing kind of like figures, all capturing in humorous kind of like poses, different things. There are now well over 250 of these kind of like pieces of art along the road. They didn't ask Main Roads permission to become the Tin Horse Highway. They just declared it. Much easier to beg forgiveness than ask permission. Just do it. But what I loved was the fact that our Premier at the time was called Gallop, and they invited him to come and open the Tin Horse Highway. I love their sense of humour. They also recognised if you want to keep people in town, we need to develop retirement homes. And the other thing that they did that I thought was remarkable is they had another quite interesting asset in that town, and that is that the very first conscript, a person who was chosen by ballot to kind of like go into the army during the Vietnam War, was a corporate heart. And he was the first national serviceman to be killed in Vietnam. His parents ran the post office in Coolin. And so one of the initiatives they've done is to create Camp Heart, which is a place where Vietnam vets can come and remember their kind of like contribution. And so at any stage of the year, you can have up to 40, 50 wagons of Vietnam vets and their families camping out in kind of like Coolin. They recognised that Vietnam vets, like they were in the States, were not overly welcome in many places. And here was a town that became Vietnam vet friendly. And boy, have they paid the positive consequences of taking that initiative. A number of Vietnam families have moved into town and become residents there simply because they love this particular place. And then they recognised that all these people, because of the Tin Horse Highway, was driving through their town, and they thought, you know what? All these caravans and wagons and vans could become a mobile advertisement for Coolin. So their community development officer did a course in how do you put up a 10-foot by 10-foot poster without wrinkling it on the side of their caravans. And you know, today there's close to 180 people driving around Australia advertising Coolin. They are called mobile advertisements for Coolin. This is a town that thinks of amazing things to be more than just a dot on the map. Then they recognised they had these amazing heritage assets, and they've gone on to create these evening heritage programs. They've won national and state awards for their heritage kind of like contribution. This is a town that's recognised it's not deficient, it is just full of so many assets. And so a group of leaders, a group of people, not just in local government, but a group of local farmers who once said to me, you know what, after my farm, after my family, my town comes next. And they've all stepped up and actually made the difference. They're totally idea opportunist. For example, there's this thing that happens in the States called the Blazing Swan, where they built this massive swan and then in the middle of the night they set fire to it. And they thought, you know what, we've got the infrastructure with our Coolin race events, why don't we attract that event to our little town? It happens over Easter and 4,000 people come out to actually enjoy this particular event. You know, we're talking about a tiny little town that has just constantly looked at what it can do in terms of opportunity. Also, as things started to happen, they tapped into the generosity of local people. And a local farming family, the husband and wife didn't have children, they died, and they left $1.2 million to the community. And the community decided to invest that in building the ultimate recreation complex. What it did was to bring all of the facilities, the bowlers, the golf people, the tennis people, the football people, all together into one facility and have a magic kind of like clubhouse and whatever. But what it also did was then to free up all of those old facilities that they then started to look at new purposes for. Amazing, this is a town that is constantly looking at how it reinvents itself. And one of the things it did with the old bowling pavilion was to turn that into a campsite. And in comes a woman who was just impressed with what was happening in the town, and she said, I want to bring an industry to town. Every town is looking for an industry. Locals thought she was talking about producing canvas wear or thongs or something. No. Her industry was, you know what? I have this thing called camp where I bring foster kids together for a 10-day camping experience. Why don't we base it here in Coolin? And you know, every year now over 1,000 kids in foster care come out, over 100 volunteers across the state drive out here, foster families drop them off and bring them back. Could you imagine the difference that has to the local economy? absolutely amazing what it's done. And that little business now employs 4 full-time staff in this tiny little town. What I've shared with you is just a few of the stories of what a town that was determined to be more than a dot on the map could do for itself. And the consequence is they are no longer 287 people, they're 450 people. That is amazing growth. And boy, you go into that town and you think, you know, why aren't I living here? This is an amazing place. How did it happen? A group of local people, and let me say mainly a group of farmers who said, you know what, we're not going to die. We are going to make this town happen. And if it's to happen, we are going to kind of like make it happen. So that's the first characteristic of leadership. A leader doesn't dream, doesn't keep just producing reports and documents and spreadsheets. It actually makes things happen. The second is leaders provide vision. If there's one idea about leadership has inspired organisations and communities for thousands of years, it is the capacity to hold a shared picture of the future we seek to create. And I think leadership is about kind of like painting a picture and then starting to paint that picture. I love also this quote, true leadership involves a vision, inspiring those around you and working with you to make that vision a reality. And I suppose that's the second role that we've got to take on, is to actually paint a picture that people want to kind of like then help to kind of like fulfill. You know, the third nicest town in Australia after the one you come from, Coolin, is a place called Bulls. Bulls is a town in New Zealand. I'll never forget, this is a town that also happens to be on Highway 1 between Auckland and Wellington. But it's a town that most of the shops were empty, a town that you would want to just accelerate through rather than stop and spend money. And I'll never forget the night that we gathered about only 22 residents in this town. It was a cold, wet night, and they wanted to talk about how do we recreate and create a new vision for Bulls. I'll never forget that night. There was a 90-year-old in the audience, and I loved the fact that when we asked people to introduce themselves, he proudly told me he was 90. Now, there's a bit of an evil streak in me that loves to kind of like push people, and I said, tell me, Bill, what's it like to be 90? And he just looked at me and said, well, when you consider the alternative, it ain't bad at all, he said, you know. I said, what do you think of the future? He said, well, I don't even buy green bananas, so why would I worry about the future, you know? And then when we got into talking about what our passions and contributions are, he proudly said, I've only got two passions left in life at 90, model railways and women. But he said, you know what, at 90 I am getting a little bit old for model railways. You know, the guy had a sense of humour. So when we get into talking about what's the asset of the town, he says, the name, Bulls. And I said, well, what do you mean, Bill? He said, well, imagine what we could do with the name. We could promote ourselves as the only town in New Zealand where you can get milk from bulls. He said, you know what, we could become a sister town to cows in England. You know, he had a whole pile of these stupid one-liners. But what he did do was inspire people. And people started to say, you know what, Bill's right, the name's an incredible asset. Maybe we could do something around it. Maybe we could become the unforgettable town. Maybe we could become a town like no other. He had a whole pile of these amazing things. And so the town decided to become truly the Bull Town. And what they decided to do was to encourage every business in town, every institution in town to adopt a bull name. And so everyone has changed their name to a bull name. And so one shop is called Full as a Bull, the other restaurant is called Delectable, the bank is called Bankable. This is the young woman that's driven the whole initiative and provided the vision and leadership, Bronwyn Meads. You know, that bank was held up about 12 months ago. Her committee, in the middle of the night, these guys came in with a forklift and ran off with the ATM. By 7:30 the next day, she and her committee had a banner stretched across the bank, and it simply said, robbable. And that sign appeared on the front page of the top newspaper in New Zealand. You can't buy publicity like that. You know, you tell me a town in Your part of the world that's been written up in 4 international airline magazines. Bulls has. You know, everyone wants to be photographed in front of their toilet block, relievable, and kind of like that goes onto your Facebook. You know, one church got in quickly and it was kind of like forgivable. The other church went for redeemable. The town hall is called sociable. All the rubbish bins are kind of like responsible. And you know what? In this town, everything is possible. You know, today, you can't find a car spot in the main street. There are kind of like new antique shops, cafes, restaurants, a boutique brewery in that town. The town is thriving. And the interesting thing is that 2 years ago in the National Main Street kind of like awards for New Zealand and Australia, this town won the best main street in New Zealand. Amazing. Where did it come from? That woman called Bronwyn Mead, who provided the vision to kind of like make stuff happen. And so again, it's just interesting what small towns are actually capable of. The third key function of leadership is what I call inspiring others. And if I've got a favourite quote about leadership, it would have to be this one by John Quincy Adams. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, become more, you are a leader. I love that quote. And at the end of the day, leadership is about inspiring other people to kind of like step up and hop over the fence and start making things also happen. I love that quote of John Gardner. You know, sometimes we just got to be practical about how we get people inspired. And I love this little US town, has this amazing heritage bridge. How do you inspire people to say, what an amazing asset? What is it we could do more with it? Well, you simply close it off for the day and hold a long lunch. You know, leadership needs to be practical. When you're trying to inspire people, you've just got to find practical ways to get people excited about what can actually happen. The fourth critical function of leadership is this whole thing about collaboration. I love this guy from the little small town called Stanley in Tasmania, Bill Mollison. He actually was a co-founder of the international movement called permaculture. And I love it at one of the meetings, he said, I can't save the world on my own. It'll take at least 3 of us. And the point he was simply making is, you know what? We just need to be able to have people who join people together. We need to hold hands. And so a critical role in leadership, I believe, is facilitating kind of like collaboration between the myriad of organisations and groups and individuals we have. I love that African proverb, when spider webs unite, they can tie up the lion. And leadership is about convincing people that, you know what, together we are unstoppable in terms of where we want to go. Part of that is building relationships. And I think if there is a role that leadership has to fulfill, it's this one. As I said this morning, I do not believe that kind of like building community is any more than really relationship building. I love what Libby Obzinger, who introduced the whole Main Street program to Australia, said, relationship building is the fundamental action of community and economic building. And so a critical role in leadership is fostering kind of like relationships. I don't know how many of people have been to this town called Beechworth, but look, after your town, after Coolin, after Bulls, this is the 4th nicest town anywhere in the world. I knew this town back in the early 90s. It was an old gold mining town. It only had 2 industries at the time. One was a jail and the other was an asylum. And both of them were being closed down by the state government. This was a town in total decline. Half the town was padded up with galvanised iron. You couldn't give away a business, you couldn't give away a town. The population was collapsing. In fact, I saw, though, a journal article in a top tourism magazine only a few months ago, and they said Beechworth is without doubt the #1 small tourist town of Australia. Now, how do you go in a 30-year period from a town where you couldn't give away a business, where half the town was padded up in galvanised iron, and you become the #1 tourist small town of the country? What's happened in 30 years? How do you kind of like create that type of transformation? In fact, it's all to do with one guy. And he's the baker in the town, but he is the true leader of this town. His name is Tom Toole. But he claimed with a name like Toole, you do get sick of being called shovel and dickhead. And he reckons the best $24 he ever spent was changing his name by deed poll to Tom O'Toole. He said it sounds so much nicer. And so this guy did his apprenticeship in this place. And when he returned back to his hometown 30 years ago, he bought the bakery where he did his apprenticeship. And it was like the rest of the town. It was in total decline. This bakery had a simple turnover of $100,000 a year. It employed 2 part-time staff. He actually had to close it for 6 weeks to do the renovations. But in his words, the main thing I had to do was get rid of all the rats that were in the bakery. So he buys a bakery that employs 2 part-time staff. After 6 weeks, he opens it with 6 full-time staff. Hasn't even traded yet. But this guy has an incredible confidence about what he can do, not just with the bakery, but with this town, this declining town of Beechworth. Within 3 months, this bakery, and it's a retail bakery with a cafe attached, is employing 19 staff in a town of only 4,000 people. And today, it is the biggest turnover bakery we have in Australia. Some would say the biggest turnover bakery in the Southern Hemisphere. In a town of 4,000 people, 3 hours out of a capital city, on a road to nowhere, this guy's employing 76 staff. This year, he'll turn over $8 million in that bakery. He bought a bakery 30 years ago, then raised $100,000, and he's going to turn over $8 million. He's in a town of 4,000 people. You know how many customers is estimated he will have this year? 800,000. 800,000 people will go through his bakery. That's what it looks like at 9 o'clock in the morning. The day I took that photograph, there were 302 people in that bakery. I visited 3 other bakeries in the region. One had 1 customer, one had 2 customers, and the other had no customers, and he had 302. What's the difference? Well, 299 if you're counting. But what is the difference? What has he actually done? And you look at what he has achieved. A bakery winning the state's top tourism award 3 years in a row. They had to ask him to stop applying, give someone else a chance. The guy's absolutely amazing. And what I find amazing about Tom is he can't read and write and he can't use a calculator. But boy, he knows how to run a good business. And he knows how to provide leadership to both his staff and to the community. Not only has he replicated that in one town, he's done it in 5 other country towns in Victoria. And today, not only does he run the biggest bakery in the country, he also is one of the biggest employers in regional Victoria. And in 6 bakeries, he now employs 255 staff and will turn over $17 million. That is an amazing achievement. And I've got to know Tom, and Tom and I have become very close friends, and we often holiday together as families and whatever, and it's given me an incredible chance to keep asking this guy a very simple question. How do we make dough your way, Tom? How do we turn over the tills like you are? How do we get the tills ringing like you get them rinking? Is it because you have the best bread in town? Well, he says that's not true. He said the guy across the road wins all the ribbons at the local show for the best bread, but he's never employed more than 1 person, and in fact 5 years ago he went broke. So it's not about even having the best product or service. What he claims is the secret to running a successful business is it's all about relationships. We are not in the business to build products and services. We're in business to build relationships. And to me, the critical role of entrepreneurs and leaders in town is to build and to foster and to cultivate kind of like relationships. And there are 4 critical relationships you need. The first is with the customer. Please kind of like wait to be tolerated. I was in a little mining town in northern Queensland the other week. I lost my watch. I wandered into this place and they had 2 watches in the cabinet. But you know what? The 2 staff weren't interested in me and the customer. They were more interested in talking about their weekend. And for 12 minutes, I stood there as the only customer, totally unattended. The international benchmark is you acknowledge a customer within 30 seconds. You talk to a customer within 3 minutes. You answer a phone within 4 rings. This is the international benchmarks. It took them 12 minutes. And eventually one of them with some gum dangling out of her mouth said, "Yeah, what is it? Can I help you?" And I said, "Well, I've lost my watch. You've got 2 in the cabinet. One's $50, the other's $150. Can you tell me the difference between the 2 watches?" She stared at him, lifted her head and said, $100, as if she was being helpful. Customer service I consider to be the greatest economic issue that faces regional Australia. Our customer service is appalling, and it really is affecting.
I want to know how you knew it was 12 minutes if you didn't have a watch.
It felt like a lot longer than 12 minutes. There's always a smart ass in the audience, isn't there? Yeah. You know what? This guy looks after his customers. He never takes less than $25,000 on a Sunday, a bakery, but he does pay $1,500 to have a jazz band on the balcony. This is a guy who recognises smell's the most powerful sense of the human body. So you know what he's done? He's got pipes running from his bakehouse to his veranda with fans on the veranda pumping hot bread smells up and down the main street. This is a guy who has one guy 3 days a week who visits every B&B, hotel, motel within a 2-hour radius of Beechworth, gives them a bag of fresh biscuits and a wad of these vouchers, and you can see they're all numbered in the top right-hand corner, and says, "Why don't you treat your customer to a free cappuccino at the Beechworth Bakery?" Do you know 1 in 3 of these vouchers find their way back to the bakery? He claims particularly Canadians will drive 2 hours out of their way for a free coffee. He said that's one nationality that you really got to target, August is his worth trading month. So what's he do? He turns it into Kindy month. And he invites all his kids to come, not just visit the bakery, but to make biscuits and take them home for mum and dad. He said, "You can't believe it. This is the biggest turnover bakery in the country." Imagine, he said, the chaos that these brats create. But he said, "You know what? Every one of these brats leaves the place as a disciple, as an apostle for the Beechworth Bakery. And 1 in 3 will end up back in the bakery within the month with their parents." Every month he has a festival operating within his bakery. He uses the street as an extension of his shop with pie eating competitions and all of that type of stuff. This is a guy that recognises, it's about creating experience for the customer. The customer is kind of like what it's about. And his favourite quote is, "If you don't look after the customer, someone else will." And to him, this is what it's actually all about. He has, for example, reaction feedback sheets in his bakery. He claims at least 40 of these a week. 40 people a week are telling him how and giving him ideas about how he can actually generate more money. I spoke to him only a few weeks ago before I left, and he said, "Peter, I can't believe it. A young girl comes into the bakery. She fills in on one of my sheets. 'Dear Mr. Beechworth Baker, there were too many people in your shop and your prices were too expensive.'" So like all customers, back when a letter from the staff saying, "Dear Joanne, we're awfully sorry you had a bad experience at the Beechworth Bakery. Please find enclosed $20 to make up for your poor experience." He said the little brat rang me 2 days later and said, "Listen, I were there with 2 mates. Do they get $20 also, And he said, "You know what? That's the type of relationship you need to have with the customer." The second relationship is kind of like with his staff. I love that quote. I spend a lot of money training my staff. Some locals think I'm investing too much money in my people. And they say to me, Tom, what if you train them and leave? To which I usually reply, what if I don't train them and they stay? You know, this is a guy that understands logic. He sends them to the best training institutes. You know, last year he sent 4 of his staff to America to do work experience. You're 21 and the boss sends you to America for 2 weeks. You know, Elizabeth was 22 and she's sent to the biggest bakery in America to just look at window displays. The commitment that his staff has to him is absolutely amazing. Most of his staff are of this vintage. And so, you know, this is the staff that do want permanency, but they also want to travel. Young Australians, a bit like young Canadians, they love to kind of like travel the world. So what's he done? He set up an exchange program with a bakery, one in Ireland, one in Norway and one in New Zealand, where his staff can swap jobs for 12 months and keep their permanency. They swap jobs, swap cars, swap houses, keep the same partner and have a fantastic year, kind of like for the year and whatever. You know, this guy understands what it's all about. He also sent a group of his staff to Disney World to do the Masters in Disney World. Can you imagine the boss is sending you to Disney World to do a Masters? Amazing, the commitment. And then the third kind of like relationship he reckons is important is the relationship with the local community. He's at the front of kind of like fundraising for local charities. When the vicious, Black Saturday fires went through Victoria, it was the bakery in Beechworth that was the operational centre for the fire service. Every year he runs a bike thing between his 6 bakeries, all the money kind of like going to the fire service and whatever. Here's a guy that recognises, if you're going to live in a community, run a business, then you know what, put up your hand and get involved in your town. And the final kind of like relationship he reckons is absolutely vital is that with other businesses and suppliers. And so relationship building is vital. The 5th function that I think is vital in leadership is that I think leaders instill a positive mindset. You know, those 2 quotes by, 2 famous people out of history capture it well. You know, a leader is a person who inspires others to kind of like look up, think up, act up, and so on. This guy, Roy Powell, probably knows more about small towns in Australia than any other person I've ever met. For 60 years as an academic, he has studied small town Australia. And I love the quote he came out with. Nowadays, towns are really not so different from businesses. They need to keep recreating themselves. Not so many years ago, country towns were subject to general trends. They'd all do well or they'd all do badly. The picture now is very uneven. The successful towns are likely to be driven by people who are passionate and creative, who see an opportunity and go for it. You need communities with a bit of get up and go spirit. Some have it and some don't. And I believe that's the reason that I can quote you in every state of Australia, 2 towns are mere 30 k's apart. One's going forward and one's going back. It's all to do with that type of spirit. I love this quote from the Heartland Centre in the United States. You can't move your town to a different location. You can move your town's attitude in a different direction. And it seems to me that the starting point for change in our communities is always mindset. How do we get people beginning to focus on possibility and potential and opportunity rather than wanting to wait for the cavalry to turn up? One of the best examples I know comes out of the city of Christchurch, that place devastated by the earthquake, this amazing Victoriana city shattered. And out of that shattering, kind of like real leaders have kind of like stepped up. And one of them I absolutely love and adore is this woman called Vicky Buck. Boy, she's amazing. She's the deputy mayor of the town. You know what? She introduced giraffe awards for people who are prepared to stick out their neck and have a go. This is a woman who, when I ask her, what's your number 1 role as a leader? She's very blunt. It's to make negative people deviants. because that is what they are. I love this quote. I think negative people should be taxed. They require an incredible amount of energy. They're like corgi dogs nibbling at your ankles. And I'm sure they exist to show us the difference between heaven and hell, you know. Now, you mightn't agree with the theology, but you know what? I think she is kind of like spot on. She also has a lovely other quote, and I love it. When facing a difficult task, act as if it's impossible to fail. When going after Moby Dick, bring along the tartare sauce, you know. Unfortunately, I pinched that quote for a recent local government conference in Australia, and Greenpeace were in the audience, and they did not really appreciate my quote, you know. And finally, can I say that a role of leaders is to foster leadership. One of the greatest kind of like negative things I see in so many country towns is the same old faces do everything. The same old faces actually seem to love the power. The same old faces just keep perpetuating, and they recognise that, you know what, it's not in their personal interest to kind of like generate other people. I love that last quote. Leaders don't create followers, they create more leaders. And one of the critical roles of leadership is to generate more, particularly, I think, amongst younger people. I love this quote out of Scotts Bluff in Nebraska. If you want a year of prosperity, grow grass. If you want 10 years of prosperity, grow trees. If you want 100 years of prosperity, grow people. And I think that needs to be almost the type of statement that all of us need to kind of like adopt within our towns. You know, this is the 5th nicest town in the world after your town. I forget what the other 4 are, but this is a town called Tumbarumba. We have some amazing names in Australia. And this is a beautiful town up there in the snowy mountains called Tumbarumba. It's a community of about 2,500 people. About 10 years ago, it's suffering what a lot of country towns were suffering, and that was the lack of people willing to step up and take on roles in the town, including the emergency service area. Young people in particular did not seem interested in what they're doing. But this is a town that has one of these community banks, and all the profit of the banks goes back to the community. And every year they gather to talk about how do we use our financial dividend to benefit our town. And about 10 years ago at one of these meetings, people from the local council, from the local school, emergency services, the bank, from the Return Service League people, they all came together and they said, you know what, the biggest challenge our town faces is the lack of people stepping up and taking on leadership roles in our town. We're suffering from volunteer burnout. There just ain't enough people putting up their hand. What is it we could do to use that money to generate more leaders in the town? And in a little community, pretty isolated, a mere 2,500 people, they have put together the most amazing program. And what simply happens every second year is that town, with both their financial dividend from the bank and what they raise in the community, create an opportunity for every young person in the last 2 years of high school to go off to New Guinea and walk the Kokoda Trail. The Kokoda Trail has incredible kind of like significance to Australians because this was the trail that Australian soldiers stopped the Japanese on as they moved south in New Guinea to invade Australia. This is where the Japanese invasion stopped. And it's in a rugged kind of like trail, incredible. It takes 14 days. It's one of those ultimate kind of like experiences you can do. And so over the last 10 years, close to 200 young people in this town, supported by 150 people in the town, have walked this Kokoda Trail. And when you walk the Kokoda Trail, you do become a global citizen. You do discover leadership. You do discover what teamwork is actually all about. And you go today into Tumbarumba, there's no shortage of people putting up their hand. The young people come back and they're incredibly inspired to kind of like want to get involved and make a difference. I think for a little town of 2,500, that's the type of initiative that we need to be looking at. Let's just not hope people put up their hands. Let's put in place processes that get people excited about wanting to make a difference in their lives and in their communities. And to me, that's one of the best examples I know. Can I finish with one analogy and one simple quote? I collect old historic cameras, and I particularly am fascinated by the Kodak company. And I find their story is very applicable to us as we face the future. In 1998, Kodak, as the biggest camera company in the world, had 170,000 employees, and it sold 85% of photo paper worldwide. But within 3 years, that company went bankrupt. They had been operating for close on 80 years. Kodak did not see the changes that were happening within the photographic industry, despite the fact that the very first kind of like digital camera was invented in 1975. And yet 25 years later, they had not adapted to the changes that were happening. And it seems to me that us in rural towns need to acknowledge that our rural communities are in constant change. The future ain't what it used to be. And that the future lies with those towns that are willing to constantly adapt to new opportunity and new possibility, recognising that the future ain't what it used to be. And finally, can I just leave you with an amazing story out of Africa? Africans will often quote this to you. Every morning in Africa, a springbok wakes up and it knows that it must run faster than the fastest lion or it'll get killed. Every morning, a lion wakes up and it knows it must outrun the slowest springbok or it'll starve to death. What do you think is the point of that African story? Any idea? What's the point of their riddle? Well, it's simply this. Doesn't matter whether you're a lion or a springbok. When the sun comes up, you better be running. And you know what? The Vancouvers of this world and the Seattles and the Torontos are really the lions. They're all interested in tourists. They're interested in entrepreneurs. They're interested in population. We in our small towns are really the springboks. But the same sun rises on both of us. And if we're interested in getting tourists in, if we're interested in attracting people to come and live in our town, you know what? We're in competition with the world. And we've got to recognise that if we do want to have a future, we need to be up and running early in the morning. We cannot hope that somehow the future will happen. We've got to create the future. And to me, that is the message that we need to get behind. Thank you very much.
How about that? I got up there.
You did.